Why, hello there. I'm Sen. We're in the Book Nook, and today we are going further down the rabbit hole that I have been taken on since reading the Dark Tower series by Stephen King. So after reading it, I decided I wanted to reread actually Salem's Lot, which is what we're going to talk about today, just for the fact that it had such a big role in the Dark Tower series. And then after this one, there's a few other ones I want to get into this year, like The Stand, Eyes of the Dragon. This was the first Stephen King book that I ever read. And I gotta be honest, it's been years and years. And I went back and I read it. It was like reading a whole new book because I did not remember anything. Like, obviously, I remembered there was vampires and, they came into the town and slowly all the town was turning into vampires and that. But outside of that, it still holds up and it's a great read. I enjoyed it intensely. It's a great vampire book. Now, it follows the story of Ben Mears, who is this writer who comes back to Salem's Lot because he wants to write a book. And this will be, I think, his third book, maybe, that he's going to write. What I think it's supposed to be about is the town, but also about this place called the Marston House. In the Marston House, there used to be this couple who lived there. It was like Hubert Marston and his wife. And Hubert Marston was a mobster and he ended up shooting his wife's head off and then he hung himself upstairs. Bad stuff all around, and that's like a weird tragedy that happened quite some time ago. That's like the town's dark history and whatnot. And so that's why Ben Mears comes to town. So he comes back, and he had lived there for a short while before when he was younger. He lived with his aunt, stayed with her for a few years, and so when he gets back to town, he's in the park and he sees this girl and she's looking at him and she's like reading his book. So he ends up going over and talking to her. Her name is Susan and she ends up being the love interest. And in my brain, I was like, oh, there was also the Susan love interest in the Dark Tower series. All right. So you get little vignettes of all the different townspeople. There is a lot of characters in this. And so you got like little windows into each of them and their behaviors and whatnot. And so as you're going through, you get, like some of the town drunks and the guy who works at the dump. And then you also get a little bit on this lady, Sandy McDougal, who lives in a trailer with her husband. She's like 17 and they have a baby and they got married. And so the baby is Randy. And Randy is crying and making a big noise. And she just is not a great mother. She throws the bottle at his head and it hits him in the head and it leaves a red circle on his forehead. And I was like, oh, wasn't that the mark of the Crimson King? So I'm reading this book with eyes on it after reading The Dark Tower. So I'm seeing these little things. And maybe it was all subconscious on King's part, because this book came before that. So who knows? I don't know. So that, and then she also punches her baby in the face. She's kind of the worst. Stuff starts to get weird. One of the cemetery workers, he goes and there's a dog hanging on the fence one day. And so that's a bit upsetting. They think maybe it's kids or something, this, that, and the other. But then there's these two boys that go out into the woods and they feel like there's like this weird presence and maybe someone's out there. And then they disappear. And only one of them ends up coming back. And the other kid is gone. And after that, people start to disappear. Eventually, Ben Mears and this other teacher guy, Mark, they figure out that there's vampires in town and they actually believe each other. Ben had an experience when he was younger. He had gone up to the Marston house, and when he went there, he was dared by some of his friends to go in there and take something from the house and then come back out. So he went in there, but then he decided he wanted to do one more and like explore a little bit more. So he went up to the room where the guy hung himself and he opened the door. And when he did, he saw the body hanging there, which shouldn't have been there because this is years later. And then he said it opened his eyes. And so he ran freaking out, got the F out of Dodge and got out of there. So he had that experience. And so maybe that opened him up a little bit more to believing in things such as vampires. Okay, so him and this teacher, they're trying to figure out what to do about this. Also, there ends up being this younger boy, Mark Petrie, who was really into horror and read about like different monsters and vampires and stuff. So one night, one of the boys who disappears shows up at his like second story window, and there's no way he could have got up there, and he's like floating there. And so he kind of knows, like, he's like, this kid's a vampire. Like, he just knew, yeah, kids are a little more open to things than adults. And so he ends up eventually meeting up with them and kind of coming into their little party. And eventually, like, Susan starts to believe what they're talking about. And that whole little thing was kind of like, oh, and there's also the doctor too. So it was kind of like they were forming their quartet. Maybe, maybe not. But I had the whole vibes of like this kid was a gunslinger because he did get caught in the Marston house, but he escaped being hogtied. And then he took like the leg of this bed and he beat the crap out of Straker and killed him. And Straker was Barlow, the major main vampire in this, his familiar. So that kid's a freaking gunslinger. And then he ends up going catching up to Ben and them because he finds out that, oh, they actually know what's going on. Everyone else is like either doesn't want to believe it or refuses to, or thinks they're saying a bunch of BS and whatnot. And so that kind of reminded me of how, like, in the Dark Tower, you have Roland and Jake. So you see that in like Ben and Mark. So I don't know. I just kind of felt that whole vibe was similar to that. They're going after vampires. They're not using guns and anything, they're using stakes, but dude, gunslingers. Maybe I'm just grasping for straws. I don't know. There are similarities there. So I'm just kind of saying what I saw in relation to that. But yeah, this was a great reread. It still completely stands up. If you like vampire books and you haven't read this and you're a Stephen King fan, like, definitely read it. It really made me wish that there was a sequel because how it ends too, like, there could totally have been a full book sequel. There is two short stories about it. One of them I'm going to read. It's in his book of short stories called Night Shift. I think it's just called Jerusalem's Lot. So I think that's what it's called. And I forget what the name of the other one is. Those were my few tie-ins to the Dark Tower. Oh, then yeah, obviously you have Father Callahan, who plays a big role in the Dark Tower. He's there too. What happened? What happened with him and Barlow and all of that stuff. It's crazy too. Like, even then, King's writing style is so good. Cause I'm like, isn't this? I think Salem's Lot, wasn't that his second or third book? I want to say it was his second. And just the way he writes, the way he draws and puts a story together, the character development, and even with so many different characters, I never got confused. It was easy to remember who was who, and that does not always happen. There's a lot of books you'll read, and people, like, some authors just can't do it with that many characters. King somehow managed to, or I don't know, maybe this book was easier than others to follow all the different characters and whatnot, but so the reread was definitely pretty awesome. Last year, was it last year or 2 years ago, I reread The Shining. So I do like to go back and reread King books here and there. And I had reread The Shining because I had never read Doctor Sleep and wanted to get into Doctor Sleep and all that. So, yes, my next King book that I will be reading most likely will be The Stand, and then probably the new one when that comes out, which I think is in May, Never Flinch. I would highly recommend it if you haven't read it. It holds up after all this time. Like, it's great. If you're a fan of Stephen King, the next video coming up will be about another Stephen King book, so stick around, check it out. And if you enjoyed hanging out today, hit that subscribe button, come back, see me again, and we'll talk about more bookish things and weird stuff.